Today is Thursday, October 10th, 2019. I'm the interviewer. My name is Nicole Morin Scribner, and today I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Michael Guignard, and we are conducting the interview in Saco, Maine. And so thank you for agreeing to be interviewed today, Dr. Guignard. Is it okay if I call you Michael?
Michael's fine.
Okay, great. And so I usually start right at the beginning and ask where, when, and where were you born?
I was actually born in Boston, Massachusetts, Jamaica Plain, this section, and July 1st, 1946. So, and I was born there because I was adopted. It's a long story, which I can go into if you'd like, but I was adopted, and I was adopted by my birth mother's sister and her husband. They lived in Biddeford, as did four other of my birth mother's siblings. And I lived here until until I got married and went to grad school.
Well, that kind of answers my second question that I usually pursue is how did you end up in Biddeford, and what's that story?
Yeah. Well, my parents got married in 1940. They got married at St. Andrew's Church, and Father Arthur Dicari was the celebrant. I've seen their marriage certificate, and this is where they lived. They worked in the mills, and my mom did until about 3 or 4 years after she was married, because they had been married 6 years before I was adopted by them.
Now, in terms of how did they come to Biddeford? I mean, in terms of that family.
Okay, yeah. My dad is one of five brothers, and his father was a carpenter, and his father actually worked on St. Andrew's Church, and they helped build it. They lived right on Pike Street, where you know how it goes down, there's flat and it goes down again. They lived on the flat part, very close to the church, because there's that little street that goes from Pike to right the back of St. Andrews. They lived right near there. And my dad, my grandfather immigrated and had 3 of his sons were born in the U.S. and they went back to Canada. And my father was born there, and then they came back to the U.S. And the 5th brother, the youngest, was born in the U.S. So my dad was really, except for his parents, he was the only Canadian among the five brothers. And my mother was born in Eagle Lake, Maine, which is where the hospital is, I guess, near Fort Kent. And she grew up in Fort Kent. Her parents lived in Fort Kent, and she was one of 10 children. And she came to Biddeford to work in the mills. She had sisters who were already here, 3 of them, as a matter of fact, who were living in Biddeford. So.
Now, do you know what she did in the mills?
I think she was a weaver. It's something that I should have talked about with them at greater length. And my dad was a loom fixer, and so since he was still working when I was growing up, I knew what he was doing. And the looms seemed to break with increasing frequency as the mills got older. I guess and David Vermette, who's going to speak on Saturday at the conference, will talk about this. But the owners of these mills knew that stuff was going to break down. They weren't going to fix them, and then they just moved.
Now, do you know where in Canada, for example, you said like your father was born in Canada, where did...
He was born in Riviere-Ouelle, which it's just a little north of the St. Lawrence, and it's north of Quebec City. And I've gone there just out of curiosity and looked at the cemeteries, and there are a lot of Guignards. We were never, there were a number of Franco-Americans in Biddeford who've kept ties to their relatives in Quebec, but my family wasn't one of those. I'm not sure why, but I never knew any of my relatives in Canada.
So when you were growing up, what language did you speak?
Oh, at home we spoke French.
Mm-hmm.
I really, when we went to school, we had the traditional half a day of French, half a day of English. I just remember when we first got a TV, which was like in 1955. I was 9 years old. I realized that they weren't speaking French on TV, and then I spoke an increasing amount of English in my daily life from that time.
So what was daily life like in your home when you were growing up?
Yeah. I never thought about this very much, but thinking back, I mean, we were very insular life. All my friends were French Canadians. All my neighbors were French Canadians. I lived on Mount Pleasant Street. I lived a couple of streets west of where Biddeford High School is. There's Maplewood Avenue where the high school is, and there's Highland, and then there's Mount Pleasant. And all my neighbors, they all went to St. Joseph's, our grammar school, and they all spoke French. All French names. We had Roy's, we had Lavoie's, we had Dutil, we had Fecteau, we had Deschambault, all French Canadian. And I never thought about where the ancestors came from or anything like that at that time. We just went out and played.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you remember any traditions in your home or special meals or?
My maternal grandparents continued to live in Fort Kent until like 1954. So we would go up there. The Pepperell used to close for 2 weeks, so everybody took their 2-week vacation at that time, and we'd go up to Fort Kent then. And also, we spent a couple of Christmases in Fort Kent, and when my grandparents moved to Lewiston, which I was about 8 years old, we'd go there every Christmas, all the family. And I remember my grandfather used to give us the blessing, la bénédiction pour le jour de l'an. And we don't do that anymore, but sorry, I'll turn this off.
Okay, so you remember the holidays so when did you celebrate Christmas?
Well, when we stayed in Biddeford, we always went to midnight mass, and we would celebrate at one of my aunts or uncle, or sometime at my house. They alternated. It was always a family. It was always a family affair. But we always went to midnight mass, and we'd have turkey after mass, and we'd open the presents after mass. So it might be 2 in the morning or something. But that's the way we did it.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't find it strange that all our social life was with family until I grew up, and it wasn't like that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said because your parents grew up in St. Andre's Parish, but you grew up in St. Joseph's Parish?
Yeah. When I was 2 years, my parents, when I was adopted, they lived on Pike Street, Extension Pike. It was a little south of Pool Road. And when I was 2, they moved to Mount Pleasant Street. And they lived there until I was in high school, until 1962. So that's how they got married at St. Andrews. I'm not sure where my mom lived before she got married, but they continued living on Pike Street after. And my paternal grandfather still lived on Pike, and the Guignards were in that little area.
But you grew up going to St. Joseph's Parish?
I went to St. Joseph because, if I had stayed on Pike Street, I wouldn't ended up going to St. Andrews. But I went to St. Joseph's. The only person in my family, my immediate family, that went to St. Andrews, we were here in 1980 when I was on home leave from from my assignments at the State Department, and we got here May 1st, so I spoke to the sisters, and we were. I spoke to the presentation sisters because the Sisters of Good Shepherd couldn't work this out, but they said, sure, just enroll her for the next 6 weeks. So she actually went to St. Andrew's grammar school before it closed. Well, before it became St. James.
So, from your personal experience, so you went to St. Joseph. Was there, and especially where there was some roots in St. Andre's, was there any? You don't make Mass at St. Joe's. Do you ever go to St. Andre's for Mass?
We would go to St. Andrews because sometimes because the Masses weren't at the same time. So, remember correctly, at St. Joseph, the Mass might have been at 9, while at St. Andrews it was at 9:30. And also when I'd go for weddings, I went to a number of weddings at St. Andrews, and I remember they always took that picture of the whole wedding party outside the steps, and I have some of those pictures of relatives who got married. But in terms of if you want competition between the parishes and whatever, I went to St. Louis High School, and it was funny because there were two women's high schools in the city. There was St. Joseph's and St. Andrews, but there was only one men's high school, so the boys' high school. So the boys from St. Andrews went to St. Louis High, and the principal of St. Louis at the time I was there, he was the longest principal ever. He was a principal for 8 years, from 1957 to 1965, and I can't think of his name now. But in any case, he used to say, the boys at St. Joseph always do better on the verbal SATs than the boys from St. Andrews. I always remember that, and I have still a number of high school classmates who was from St. Andrews Parish, and I managed to work that quote into the conversation. Brother Albert was his name, Albert Tatro. And he was a pretty strict disciplinarian type, but he was. If you look back at the records of St. Louis, I think he was there for 8 years. The next longest reign was 5 years. I don't remember who it was, but so they didn't have a lot of continuity among principals at St. Louis. I'm not sure why. I guess the order wanted them to move, and they had quite a few schools. They had one in Sanford. They had one in Plattsburgh, New York, Mount Assumption Institute, I think it was called. They had one in Detroit, and so they moved them around. We had one teacher, and this I thought, I always remember this. Obviously, it made an impression on me. We had this brother Leonard was his name, and he came from Detroit. He was transferred. This was before all the riots in Detroit and stuff. The automobile industry was still booming. This was 1961, 62. And he taught math. And to try to get us to work harder, he'd say, and he'd point out the window. He says, "Do you want to work the rest of your life at the Pepperell?" And he'd point out the window. That's where our parents were working. He gave one guy a grade of 6. We had numerical grades, so he gave the guy a 6, not a 6%, a 6, not 16, not 20. And the guy looked at his report card. He says, "Hey, this is going to hurt my average," he said.
You mean 6 out of 100?
6 out of 100. He gave him a 6 in Algebra 1.
Wow. So I go back to St. Joseph's Parish. What do you remember about what role did the church play in family life and growing up?
When I started school, I started in 1952, but in 1953, Curé Élie Heve became the Monseigneur, and he was the first Biddeford-born pastor of St. Joseph. We had the first one was from Belgium, and then Curé Dupont was from Canada, and so was we had another person for 3 years, whose name escapes me right now. And then and Father Laflamme, I think, was from, he was pastor from 1920 to 1953, and he was from Canada. But Curé Heve was born in Biddeford. And I don't know, just a lot of respect for him. You know, we respected the priests, so they weren't. I remember one of the priests when I was there, Father Levesque, he played golf, and he'd go golfing with parishioners, and we'd look at each other. We didn't know priests played golf. You know, they were just very saintly people. Once a year, we would gather at the parish hall, which is now called St. James School Hall, whatever. It's right on, what's the name of the little street? I can't remember. Green. I guess it's still on Green Street. And we would get together for his birthday, and there were celebrations. And I made a copy of a picture, because there was a picture of this particular celebration in one of the yearbooks. And what we were waiting for is that he would give us a day off the rest of the day. This would happen in the morning. And he'd always say, "Vous avez un jour de congé." And out we went. So. And I'm not sure what the state laws were in terms of how many days you had to be in school, but you know, if we sold a lot of candy on a fund drive, trying to get money for the school, you know, we'd get a afternoon off. So most people are in 1963 were in high school. I was a junior in high school. When Kennedy was shot, we were in school. My wife, who went to Thorne Academy, was in school, but not me. I was at the 20th Century bowling lanes because I had gotten the afternoon off, because I sold some boxes of candy. So I always remember that.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the JFK assassination, because that's usually something that I ask people who were, you know, around at that time, and what do they remember, what impact that had.
Well, we knew Nick Gillis, who ran the bowling alley, and we were bowling. I was bowling with Leo Dumichel, a classmate. He sold lots of boxes too, and Nick said, "The president's just been shot." We thought he was kidding. We continued bowling. He had a little TV on his counter, and he turned the volume up, and Walter Cronkite was talking. So, you know, we knew that something bad had happened.
Mm-hmm. And what impact did you see that had on people and the community when that happened?
You know, I used to read a lot of political stuff. Even then, I'd read Time magazine, Look magazine, Life, whatever. And I remember there were a lot of northeastern liberals who said, "Well, you know, it's those Texans over there, and they're bad people." I thought that you know, it had been a political assassination. I didn't know, and I don't know. You know, I followed the Warren Commission, and there were some very respected people who served on that commission. But somehow I don't think we've gotten the whole story. It's hard to know. Mm-hmm. It's hard to know.
So I turned the clock back again to St. Joseph's Elementary School. So other than the sales and any other recollections and going to school, half French, half English, anything else you remember about going to school at St. Joe's?
Yeah, I remember one incident, and I hadn't. I must have struck me because I still remember it, although I didn't think much about it at the time. People would still immigrate from Quebec to Biddeford in the 1950s. This is before the Immigration Act of 1965, which made it more difficult for people who had traditionally come. But I remember we were in the second grade, so we would have been, I don't know, 7 years old or something. I remember we had this student who must have been, and he wasn't in our class for very long, but he must have been 12 or 13 years old. Yeah, and I remember he could hardly fit in the desk, but the teachers only spoke with him in French. And my guess is that, you know, his family had just immigrated from Canada, and this was a way to help him to try to learn a little English and try to assimilate and acculturate more quickly than if he had been in a public school. He wouldn't have gotten individual attention from religious sisters who all spoke French, you know. So I just remember that for some reason.
Do you remember when, now I know that in terms of classes, half of the day was in French, half was in English. Do you remember when you got out on the playground? What were you speaking?
I spoke French, you know, and we had a long lunch break. My kids, you know, get 20 minutes. So when they were in school, they got 20 minutes. Because I remember I would have time to eat my lunch quickly, walk to MacArthur Library. I had my little shortcut. I'd go down Graham, and then there's the big white church, and across the street there's a little small brick church. There was a little path there. I'd go through there and go to the library, spend, I don't know, like 45 minutes at the library and go back for my afternoon classes. So the lunch break must have been like an hour and 15 minutes or something. You know, much longer than they would be now. I just remember things that I've saved from the classes. The sisters would give us des images, you know, little religious photos of saints with little prayers on them. We'd get that if we behaved well. And I remember, another thing I remember is we all got polio shots. This was 1953, and Salk and Sabin have made their big discoveries. I remember one of my classmates, he was really afraid. His name was Bobby Menard. He's passed away. He lived on Highland, so he was practically a neighbor. I lived the next street over. And he just fainted, just fell before he got the shot. We kept teasing him about that, all through high school even.
Now, was it mixed, girls and boys?
Yeah, it was. Most people didn't go through this, but we were baby boomers. So the school on Birch Street became too small. So the city leased Birch Street School to the parish for $1 a year, I guess. So there were 3 classrooms and a lunchroom. So there were 4 classrooms, and I was sent over there. And those 3 classrooms were all boys. So the boys who continued staying at St. Joseph's, the building itself, I would think that like 3/4 of their classmates were girls. But I remember I spent the 4th grade, 5th grade, and 6th grade at the old Birch Street School, which now been torn down. It's not there anymore. And I went to St. Louis Junior High, so that was in the St. James building in the 7th grade. But in the 8th grade, they made the lunchroom another classroom, and I ended up there. That was my homeroom for 8th grade. Mr. LaPointe was our teacher. He was our homeroom teacher. So, you know, I always told people, I said, from the 4th grade until graduate school, I never had girls in my class. Not in high school, not in college. So it started at 4th grade.
So you went from St. Joe's to, like you were saying,
St. Louis Junior High.
And then
the brothers taught us. The big difference was the brothers taught us at St. Louis Junior High. The brothers are Christian instruction.
Okay. And that would have been 7th and 8th grade?
7th and 8th grade, yeah. So the school year is 59-60 and 60-61. So I remember when John Glenn went his 15-minute ride, we were in class and we were following it on the radio. And it was St. Dominic's. The school was called St. Dominic's, but it was really St. Joseph's grammar school. Mm-hmm. So.
And then St. Louis. So tell me about your experience at St. Louis High School. What was that like? St.
Louis, I mean, it wasn't a big difference for us because I had spent the 7th grade in that building and I knew people and I went to school right across the street, you know. But the difference was that we got boys from St. Andrews, people I didn't know, so I got a chance to know. We had we had a class of, we started about 80, so about 25 of them were from St. Andrews, and we had three people from St. Mary's. Most of the St. Mary's grads went to Biddeford, went to Biddeford High School, but the 3 were Dick Agresti, Don Wilson, and John Conway, all prominent members of the community today. And I still tease them because one time at St. Louis, you didn't find people walking around the halls and stuff. You know, you were where you were supposed to be. But for some reason, somebody had sent me to the principal's office to deliver a message. So I walked around, and there was Marcel Drapeau, the band director, was teaching French to Conroy, Wilson, and Agresti, because these guys were 8 years behind us in French. And I still see these guys from time to time. I always tease them about that.
Now, what about activities at St. Louis at the time?
I belonged to a number of activities. I was in the student council. I was in the National Honor Society. I worked on the school newspaper, on the Flyer it was called. I didn't work on the yearbook. That was a real tough job. And you know, they started in November for a yearbook that was coming out in June. But there were quite a few activities. I mean, sports though. I mean, we only had 3 sports, which is, you know, most of the other high schools had. They would have track, and the girls would have. I think the girls just played basketball. I don't think they played field hockey. So in terms of sports, it was more limited. Of course, we were a smaller school than the public schools in the area, even then. Mm-hmm. But no, there were you know quite a few activities, and you know there are certain things that we did in high school. Again, we were out of class, but on Thursday, on the first Friday of the month, we'd go to mass as a class for the whole school, and we'd go to confession on Thursday. So this was all, you know, school time that was used for a different purpose. But I enjoyed my high school years very much.
So rivalries with other schools?
Oh, a lot. You know, especially, I said that my class started, we were about 80. Mm-hmm. We graduated 66, so that means that 14 people, they didn't, a couple of them may have dropped out, but the others went to Biddeford High School. And not so much for disciplinary reasons, some of them, but they had lower grades, and I would tend to think that on average the non-college courses at Biddeford High, where they might teach you woodworking and, you know, whatever, with the Biddeford Vocational school that they had right near the high school, we didn't have that kind of stuff. And I remember some of the classmates who transferred because they weren't interested in the college prep. And then there were others who transferred because they were not starting on the football team anymore, and they went to Biddeford High. Biddeford High, and I think this was after the Pepperell and the Saco-Lowell moved out of the city in 57, 58, but Biddeford High School actually dropped down from Class A to like Class C, so they were playing Old Orchard and schools like that. And then the enrollment started going up again because of the baby boomers. So Biddeford didn't play Thorne Academy or St. Louis between 1958. So 59, 60, 61, and 62, they didn't play St. Louis. They played again in 63, which was my junior year. And I remember that game was at Waterhouse Field. It was 7-6, St. Louis won. It was a close game. So there was a lot of rivalry. Mm-hmm. And you know, these people had known each other all. You know, they had gone to the same schools. And Biddeford wasn't that big a city. I lived on, as I mentioned, I lived on Mount Pleasant Street. On Mount Pleasant Street, we had this big, huge house that's now like a old folks home or assisted care. It was called Shaw's. I don't know what it's called now, but it was owned by Jerry Shaw and his family. And there was Shaw's house. He would let us sled down his front lawn. There was Shaw's Hill, there was Shaw's Field, there was Shaw's Woods, you know, and that's where we played. And we had sort of an informal football league. So kids from eastern part of Biddeford, where St. Andrew's Parish was, would come over and play our team at Shaw's Field. We had made sidelines and little goalposts and things like that. Now it's a housing development, so they must have sold the land, because all of that land was owned by the Jerry Shaw family. If you grew up in that area in the 50s and early 60s, you know the Shaws. And we always went there for a trick or treat because they gave some nice candy.
Now, were you aware of other? I know you said that when you were growing up, it was pretty a homogeneous group, the French Canadians. Did you encounter any other ethnic groups in Biddeford growing up that you can remember?
Actually, the answer to that question is basically no. Although I belong to a little league. We had little league bowling at the pastime, so we bowled for free, and companies would sponsor us. So one of the team that I bowled for was Riviere-Ouelle Distributors. I never went there. I guess that they were near. They were in Biddeford, near where Merck was, right along Lincoln. In any case, there were some kids from Saco there on the team and in the league, so I got a chance to meet them. But at Biddeford High School, the only people that I knew pretty well were kids that had started high school with me, you know. My existence was homogeneous. I never thought of anything about it. It was just the way it was, you know.
Mm-hmm. What did you do for fun as a teenager?
Well, when I was in grammar school, in the winter we'd slide down Shaw's Hill. In the summer we'd go into Shaw's Wood and we'd hike. One of the families on the street, the Roys, there were about 9 kids. The oldest one is a religious sister. She's a sister of Good Shepherd. But they always had little activities. There were family activities, and they just let everybody else come. But we would run around the woods, play cowboys and Indians. By my freshman year in high school, I went to a lot of football games. I very seldom missed the St. Louis football games. I had an aunt who was a widow, and she drove. Not all my aunts drove. My mother didn't drive. She drove, and she would take us. Her name was Gertrude Wood. She was Joe Wood's mother. Joe Wood was a teacher at Biddeford High for many, many years, and he was also in the Peace Corps. So I'd go. I went to games at Lewiston. I went to games in Rumford. I went to games in Bangor. Basketball a little less so. I mean, I remember, and I was in junior high then. The Baltimore Colts had won the NFC Championship. They had beaten the Giants in overtime, 23-17, and Lenny Moore was a big star for that team. And he came, and we heard him speak at Biddeford Junior High gym, at Biddeford Junior High on Alfred Street, that had been the high school. And I remember, and everybody went, this is Lenny Moore, and he gave the traditional. I didn't study in college, but I want you guys to study. I remember that particular event, and I did the Little League bowling. We did that on Saturday morning. The league, we bowled 2 games, and then you got 1 point for each game and 1 point for total. So you could be 3-0 or 2-1 or 1-2 or 0-3. So, and I started going to dances at the parish hall, and sometimes at the Lightning, which was at the St. John's Hall. And I until I started doing research on Franco-Americans, I never noticed that plaque that's in the cement saying Saint Jean Baptiste 1896. I know, because there were 2. There was Union Saint Jean Baptiste, which was on the corner of Jefferson and Adams, and there was that. And I finally figured out what the difference was. One was a local that never became a national, while Union Saint Jean Baptiste was federated with the people in Woonsocket.
So the one that's connected with, has the bigger connection, is the one that's on the corner of Maine,
Maine
and Elm.
Yeah, I think they're I think they disbanded. I'm not positive, but I think they're disbanded. But although l'Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste d'Amérique, they're still, it's a mutual insurance company, so they're insurers, and they're still in Woonsocket, and they have chapters all over. Succursale is what they call them in French.
And so were those live bands? Were those DJs?
Mostly DJs. I mean, the live bands. So I worked at Old Orchard at the end of my sophomore year and the end of my junior year. So the live bands were in Old Orchard at the Palace, which is now at the parking lot, and they have some amusements. If you know where that was. So we did that. I spent a lot of time at Old Orchard when I worked there because I'd go there when I wasn't working. We could ride the rides for free. But I worked at the Palace Playland, so we could ride the rides for free. And I also spoke a lot of French because there were a lot of tourists from France, and then I enjoyed speaking French. There was an area, a time when I was growing up that speaking French was sort of niaiseux, But then when I got to high school, and when I was in college, I took some French literature courses.
If I go back to when you used to go to the dances, like at Saint Jean Baptiste,
Right.
was that because we've talked about different parishes? Did the Biddeford High School kids go there? Was that an opportunity when your circle started getting bigger?
Well, at St. Joseph's, at the parish hall, the dances were just high school, just your high school. So you knew everybody. So if you wanted to go to a place where you didn't know everybody, you'd go to what's called St. John's Hall, or even l'Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste. That hall, I went to a number of weddings at, but they also had some dances there. I don't know who was sponsoring them, but I remember, the dancing. But at St. John's Hall on the corner of Elm and Maine, I went to my 50th college reunion, and I remember one of the guys that I saw there was a classmate of mine at Bowdoin. So I saw him, and I said, the first time I met you was at the St. John's dance. He remembered. It was a place where there were people you knew, because some of your classmates and people from other schools, so maybe Biddeford High or whatever, so that you could meet people from different high schools there. And sometimes the kids from Biddeford High might come to our dances, because they had gone to school with us in grammar school.
So you mentioned when you were a sophomore in high school, you worked at Old Orchard. What other kind of jobs did you have?
Yeah, I worked at Old Orchard for 2 summers, and then I worked at Elm Laundry, which was right near where the Dairy Joy is. There was a couple of buildings there, and I worked at that laundry, and I worked 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. And we would they would have these big dryers, and we'd take there were a lot of sheets. We had a lot of motels that were in the summer that were our clients. We'd take the sheets and put them in a box and whatever. And then my senior year, I worked at the Lordge's Bakery. It was on Beacon, which is closed now, and I had to accept a position to start working at the end of May to get the job in the summer. And my parents were dead set against this. They said, "You can't be serious." I said, "Well, I need the money," and so I would work. And two of my high school classmates were with me, Guy Roy and Dennis Dutrumbull, the former state senator. We worked the midnight shift, and we'd get out of work at 7:30, go home, shower, and then go to school. And we did that for 2 weeks until school ended. So I always tell my kids, I said, "You know how hard I had it." But yeah, the 3 of us, and there was we had two other workers on the shift. We had a fellow named Pate, who was Biddeford High School. It was a Pate used car place right on Upper Elm Street, Route 1, where the new courthouse is going to be. They're building a new York County Courthouse or something over there. And he worked with us, and then we had a supervisor who was French Canadian.
Hmm.
So,
So go ahead.
and then I worked at Marymount in the summers when I was in college. And they had a place. The section was Gabriel Electronics. I worked in that. I worked with a fellow named Roland Gendron, a little short guy. I spoke French with him because he would like to speak French with me because he wanted to make sure that I still remembered how to speak French. I passed that test with him.
So then, at some point, you made a decision that you were going to go on to college.
Sure.
How did your family receive that, your decision to go on to college, or your desire to go on to college?
Yeah. I was a pretty good student in school, so I figured I'd go to college. And our principal, Brother Albert, the famous Brother Albert, I mean, he really encouraged us. There's a fellow who writes for the Forum, and he graduated from St. Louis in 1931. I can't remember his name now, but he writes that the kids in his class, I'm sorry, he was born in 1931. He would have graduated in the late 40s. He says that the kids in his class couldn't wait to get out of school and go to work. They figured they were wasting their time. But by the early 60s, the principal was encouraging students to go to college. Now, my parents, I had a little peculiar glitch because my dad had a heart attack in 1963 and, became totally disabled. So he never worked after 63. So money was tight. But I went to school in Brunswick, and the school was very generous to me in terms of financial aid. So I went.
I was going to ask how you chose where to go and what to study.
Yeah. I know you interviewed Mr. Cody. And Mr. Cody and the basketball coach's name at that time when I was in high school was Dudley Coyne, and they both said, have you thought about going to Bowdoin? Bowdoin, only rich people go there. But I applied, and they wanted me to apply. Well, the religious brothers wanted me to apply to some Catholic colleges, so I applied to Boston College and Fairfield, and I was accepted, but the financial package, I would have had to spend much more money going to school there than in Brunswick. And I didn't want to get that far from home because it costs money to travel, So I would always hitchhike between Brunswick and Biddeford. And my mother played bingo, and she would play bingo in New Hampshire because they had higher stakes there. The New Hampshire bingo sponsors would hire buses to pick up people from Maine to go play in Rochester or Somersworth, whatever. And the bus company was Brunswick. And my mother knew the bus people. And sometimes the bus would pick me up when I was hitchhiking. And I knew exactly where they were going in Biddeford. So I always travel that way. My parents didn't have a car at one point, so it wasn't a matter of taking a car to school. And in school vacations, I would ride with another student, and they dropped me off right on the main turnpike. I could get out and just walk onto South Street and then walk home. We were living on Adams Street at that time. We went from Pleasant Street to Adams Street, so I was very close to St. Louis High School. I went down the hill past the convent. I was there, so I could go home. We had a half an hour, no more an hour and a half for lunch in high school. We had a half an hour, but I could go home and eat and still get back before the bell rang.
So, and then how did you decide what you were going to study when you were in college?
I was always interested in government and history, and I majored in government. As a student.
Did you find it a big transition going from Biddeford to Bowdoin?
Yes, it was a different world. I mean, people think that because I went to school 50 miles from home that but it was I lived on campus. I didn't live at home, and a lot of my classmates and students there were much more prosperous than my family, and also the work was a lot harder. I mean, at St. Louis they monitored if you didn't get your homework in on time, but there nobody said a word to you. But if you didn't get the grades, you flunked out. So I had to learn some self discipline, and the kind of French literature we read in high school. I remember we read Saint-Famille. It was I don't know who I can't remember who wrote this, but it's not on the class of I'm trying to think of the French, Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus. We didn't read any of that, but I did in college, and I realized that my vocabulary wasn't as good as I thought it was. So I struggled in those courses, but I did okay.
Now, talking about struggling, did you ever encounter the traditional French versus the colloquial French that we spoke?
Yeah. Saint-Famille, that book the roman, I guess you call it, is a novel, had Canadianisms in it. But when I was in college, the vocabulary was different. Saturday, Norm Beaupre is going to be talking about La Suyon. What I like, I love the story, but what I really like is an index that he has in the back about this is the way they talk in Paris, and this is the the word we use here. And sometimes I would have to say the word out, pronounce it the way it was written, because I couldn't understand what that word was. And then when I'd say it, I'd say, oh yeah, I know that one. Mm-hmm. So not so much. I mean, I learned the correct words in college. One of my professors, his name was Eaton Leith, Leith, and he had been there for a long time. A very, very nice man. And he grew up in Brunswick, and he knew about mill workers at the Cabot Mills that David Vermette knows very well. And he always spent extra time with me, So I didn't find it a great disadvantage. I didn't think that much about it. I just used the words that I learned when I was a kid. Those are the words that I learned. When I served in Montreal as a consular officer, and I was the one. We had all kinds of different duties. One of the duties that the U.S. government provides its citizens is if you go to jail, we go visit. We make sure that you're not being discriminated against because you're American. And in Canada, it didn't happen. But I was the one who visited the prisoners because I spoke the exact language that the prison guards spoke. And so they would let me in right away. The other guys had to wait around for 2 hours, and they couldn't understand each other. So it was an advantage there. Mm-hmm. And my parents were getting kind of old. And so when we were in Canada, I bought a house on Summer Street. So that we were back on St. Andrew's Parish, But so my parents lived in that house till they died. It was right behind Emory School.
Uh-huh. So then after you graduated, once you did your undergraduate, did you go immediately to graduate school?
I went immediately to grad school. And I had been a good student in college, so I got a nice scholarship. And I was interested in the Foreign Service. So I went to the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. And I tell kids, a lot of kids take a gap year, and I don't know how many people my age you've been interviewing, but I tell them, I says, when I was your age, there was no gap school. You know why? General Lewis B. Hershey. That's why. He was the head of selective service. You took a year off, you got drafted. So.
Well, that kind of answers one of the questions that I had. I usually ask people in this age bracket, Vietnam, the draft,
Mm-hmm.
How did that fit into your life story?
Yeah. I got a story that's probably pretty unique, but it's true. When I graduated from from college in June of 1969. The first troop withdrawal was announced, 25,000 from the. I think we had 450,000 there, 25,000. So the troop level was 425,000. Now, when we lived on Adams Street, I used to go to Pete's Market, which is on Jefferson. So it was Oscar Metier and his son, Oscar Metier. Oscar Metier was on the draft board, and when I graduated, I got reclassified from 2F to 1A, and so I met with the draft board, and I showed them all the financial documents that we had that I had, and I was classified as a sole support of the family, and so they gave me that for I was getting that for 6 months, so from June of '69 until December of '69 to get my affairs in order, because they wouldn't have let me go that easily. But the draft lottery was on December 1st, 1969. People my age would remember that, and my draft number was very high. So then I didn't have to worry. I got married 2 months later. We set the date on December 2nd. And but it's that was the draft was on its way out, but they were still drafting people. There was one teacher at he was there for the last year at St. Louis. His name was Guy Roy. He was class of '65 at St. Louis, and he taught at St. Louis from '69 to '70. Now he was drafted, even though draft levels, draft calls had gone down. They were still drafting people until 1973 when the draft was abolished.
So some of the deferments or things that impacted where you were on the list of the draft were, so you got a deferment if you were in school, right? If you were in college? Yeah,
you got a deferment. The way it worked, and I knew this because I lived it. Back in the old days, if you kept going to school and graduate school and whatever, then got married and had children, you were fine. But they realized that system was really unfair. So they passed a rule saying that any individual who had a student deferment after July 1st, 1967, could not get student deferments after being an undergraduate. So for me, that's why I had the student deferment from July 67 till June of '69. So you just couldn't continue like that. So for those people in the classes of '68 and '69, before the draft lottery, the draft probably affected their lives more than other classes in that era. At Bowdoin College, a class of '68, about 20 of them wrote for their 50th college reunion. They wrote big essays on how the draft influenced what they did and how they did it and what they were thinking and stuff like that. So because the class of '70 had already, they had a number, so they knew whether they'd be drafted or not, and they could enlist in the Air Force or the Navy or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So you went on to graduate school.
I went to graduate school, and I would come home. But by then, I knew what I was going to do my dissertation on. Franco-Americans of Biddeford, Maine. What else,
Well, no, I was going to ask why you had chosen that as a topic. I mean,
I was always interested. Mr. Cody, when we were kids, we all knew we were French and stuff, and our parents worked in the mills, but we never said, well, what was it like for them to immigrate? What was it like in Canada before they immigrated? What was it like here? And a lot of them had come from rural areas to an urban area. It didn't give it a second thought. I was sliding on my sled at Shaw's Hill, But I knew that's what I was going to do. And at Maxwell, I was in an interdisciplinary program, and I took the Foreign Service exam in December of '72. I was almost done my coursework, and I passed the written, so I had an oral. You went to Washington for an oral exam the first week of February. We'd never been to D.C. and I passed that. So I entered the Foreign Service in August of 1973. Before I was done all my academic work, I was what they call ABD, all but dissertation, and I had all my research. And I was in Washington for 4 months between August and December of '73. So I finished doing some work at the National Archives and the Library of Congress. I brought all that stuff with me to Japan, and I actually wrote my dissertation there. So when my second posting was Montreal, so I had to go defend my dissertation, and I went to the graduation in 1977. I officially graduated and got my Ph.D. in December of 1976, but the graduation was in June of 1977. I was there. I was there for a homecoming about 3 weeks ago. And my daughter went to Clemson, so Clemson was playing Syracuse, so we invited her. We had a nice little get together. We showed our daughter where we first lived when we got married, and as I went to Syracuse in September '69, and I came back between semesters to get married in January 1970.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. I do want to come back to your studies and your dissertation, but tell me about how you met your wife and about your family.
Yeah. One of the places I forgot to tell you I worked was Grant's Department Store. Where, it's where the First National was, behind the Dairy Joy. And I worked there my senior year, just before I started working at the Lodges at the end of my senior year of high school. But she worked in the front at the candy and the popcorn section. I worked out on the back in the hardware, and we sold goldfish and little ferrets and things like that. And so I saw who he was, and she was kind of a shy person. I knew she was from Saco. I know she was going to Thorne Academy same year, class of '65. So I went out with her friend a couple of times to find out more about her. And our first, we went to a dance. Well, I remember it was Good Saturday, and her mother wouldn't let her go to a dance that night. So I danced with her friend. But the next day, I was taking her to the roller skating ring in Old Orchard, and she didn't tell me she didn't know how to roller skate. So I paid 25 cents for admission, 10 cents for the skates or something. But we only stayed about 15 minutes because she couldn't roller skate. But and then we went out through college. But that's how I met her. And again, you asked how I would meet people from other schools. Well, there were a lot of kids from Biddeford High and Thorne Academy working at Grant's. And I guess 5 years later, this was 1965. 5 years later, the company just collapsed. We never thought about that. Just like St. Louis, I couldn't believe that St. Louis High was closing, because I never knew they were in some kind of financial trouble. And it closed only 5 years after I graduated. I just couldn't believe it.
How'd you find out about it?
Well, I remember, and I don't know how many of your interviewees have mentioned this. I just remember because it struck me. I remember reading in February 1970 that Bob Cody had accepted a job at Thorne Academy. February, before anything about the school. And then I talked to some people. They said, the school's in real financial trouble. And then on March 31st, 1970, Biddeford Journal. It wasn't called the Biddeford Saco Journal. And big headlines, like 6-inch headlines saying St. Louis to close in June. And that was official, And I thought I was in grad school. I had just gotten married. I'd been married for a couple of months. And I had a lot of things on my plate. I never did anything to try to keep the school open. It went right by me. But I thought this can't be. They'll find a way to keep it open, but it didn't happen, So I was reading. I'm on all these Facebook things, And one of the guys, Mike Morin is his name. I don't know him. I might know him by sight, but he said, "Yeah, it says Bishop. It was Bishop Garrity's fault." He says, "I became an agnostic that day." It was a real bitter pill to swallow.
Mm.
And I guess for the church, it just wasn't a priority. In 1967, they had a diocesan drive. I remember I collected for this drive, and some of the houses that I went to, they said, "Well, there's no money here for Catholic schools." I remember they did have some money for St. Andrew's Home, which could use the money. The diocese had done nothing for St. Andrew's Home since 1940 when they started doing that work, but they didn't have money for schools.
Mm.
And St. Ignatius, I guess, had closed in '67, so I hadn't given that a second thought. I said, that'll never happen to us.
Mm. So I'm going to go back. I don't know that you told us your wife's name.
No, it's her
If you don't mind.
name. Her maiden name is Andrews, Susan Andrews, Susan Jessie Andrews.
Now, does she have any French background?
Not really. No, not really. She was, I guess, a typical student at TA, and a very poor family. I mean, she worked real hard. She went to University of Maine in Portland, UMP, for a couple of years and got an associate bachelor's degree. She finally got her degree. She got her degree a month after our daughter graduated. Our oldest daughter graduated from college, 1992. Because when I was assigned back in Washington, I was there long enough for her to finish up. And it was really funny because if you get a bachelor's degree, it's always a bachelor's degree. You could have gotten it 40 years before, but she had different courses. And when she was trying to get into George Mason, they said, "Well, we can't accept this one, we can't accept that one." It's just ridiculous, So she went to Strayer, which accepted almost all her credits. She was a good student anyway.
So what was it like? We've talked about the transition from Biddeford to Bowdoin. What was it like going from Bowdoin and Maine to
Syracuse?
Yeah.
I won a number of financial prizes at graduation in June 1969 at Bowdoin, and it was just money. One of them was, and so I bought a car. I needed a car. My parents didn't have a car, so I bought it in June. So between June '69 and September '69, we used it as a family. And a couple of times I rode with some. I rode back to Syracuse with some friends to leave the car for my dad. But Syracuse is a big city. We go back now and we think it's small because it hasn't grown. They've lost their industries too. GE used to have a big installation there, and Carrier used to make air conditioners there. And now they have their central offices, but they don't make the air conditioners. But talk about multicultural. It was much more multicultural than anything that I had ever experienced. Because at Bowdoin, they were mostly white. Well, they were all men, and almost all of them were white. We had some Fulbright scholars from Africa, and we had we had a few Latinos, but it was pretty homogeneous. But at Syracuse, we had for the first time, I had women since the fourth grade at St. Dominic's, and the work was rigorous, and we had some good professors. We had one fellow. See, there's a section of the Maxwell School that focused on diplomacy and international relations. And these professors had worked at the State Department, and so if you were interested, they gave you a lot of helpful tips and the kind of courses that you might want to take. And I took the Foreign Service exam when I was at Syracuse, so they wanted to know if I had passed. I said, yeah. They've invited me for an oral interview, and they told me, well, this is what they'll ask you. This will be focusing on.
Mm-hmm. So did you find that difficult making the transition to where there's more diversity and in a bigger city?
Well, I went there as a single person the first semester. Then I got married between semesters. So Sue was a big help. I mean, I'm the one who always flies off the handle. She's the one who just take it easy. So she was a big help to me. No, I gravitated. I was still going to church. There was a church near where we lived. I lived in the single student housing the first semester, and then we moved to married student housing. But some of my classmates and some of other students went to church there. I remember I taught that first semester in college. I taught CCD to the little kids at the church, and I continued doing that after Sue joined me in Syracuse. And it was funny because we were in Syracuse just about 3 weeks ago. So we showed our daughter and our grandson. I said, "This is the first place we lived in as a married students." But she was a big help. Hmm. And then the Foreign Service was a big change too, because I spent 4 months in Washington from August of '73 to December, and then we went to Japan. So that was a change. And I had met some Japanese students at Syracuse who were studying American history, and they had their own little club there, and I became the unofficial advisor to the club. So they told me a lot of little things that I wouldn't have known without speaking to a native from the Tokyo area. I mean, Tokyo is a big place, and you take the subway, and you have to make sure you go in the right direction. But everybody in Japanese people are very courteous, and and most of them knew enough English to be able to give you directions and stuff. So we very seldom got lost.
I was kind of curious. I saw in your background that a lot of your professional work dealt with immigration issues. Mm-hmm. Did your career just naturally evolve in that area, or was there a connection to your area of interest?
Yeah, well, it was a connection to my area of interest, and it was also a connection to my area of academic focus. When I took the Foreign Service oral exam, they ask you, are you interested in political work, economic work, consular work, or administrative work? So, I mean, for me, it's a no-brainer. It's consular work. So, I knew a lot about immigration history, so that helped me with the oral exam. Mm-hmm. And I always liked consular work. In Japan, I'd visit prisoners. We took turns, so I might have done it twice in 2 years. But the Japanese, they don't heat their prisons, so the Japanese prisons are cold. You'd be like this, but the prisoners were well treated compared to some of the places that I served at. They had all kinds of stories. I could regale you with dozens of Foreign Service stories.
I can imagine. So I'm going to come back to your dissertation and eventually tell me about how you decided to take the work from your dissertation and turn it into a book.
Okay. My parents, they read every word of the dissertation. And as I said, my parents died. My father died in 1987. My mom died in 1988. So 6 years after I got my degree, I said, I know they'd like to see this, because I dedicated the book to them. And I have a picture that I brought with me, because I know that on Saturday's conference you can get something done with the picture. I've got a picture of my parents. I'll show it to you after. I got a picture of my parents and me in the Journal Tribune when the book came out, and you can see they're pretty happy. And so I wanted to have something, I mean, the only place you could find the dissertation was the Library of Congress. Who goes there, And not only that, but it was an academic thing, so I had to change all these fancy theories and stuff, and put more personal type things in the book. But when I was on home leave, I was serving in Naples, Italy, and it was a 4-year tour. When you have a 4-year tour, you get what's called home leave. Which for me at my rank meant 3 months. Because they don't want you to forget what America's like. They don't want you to go native. That's always a problem in the Foreign Service. So I got the book printed in Italy because it was a lot less expensive. And because of home leave, you're allowed a certain weight to come, clothes, whatever. So 80% of my weight were my books. We brought them to the U.S. My parents were still living on Summer Street, and so I was home for 3 months. So I spoke to different organizations, and I remember I went to Mr. Cody's house and I gave him a book. He lived on Alfred Street at the time, and we talked for a little while. But that's
Mm-hmm. And continuing with that, I have read your book. Very, very interesting. And I was wondering, what was it like getting some of that information from people?
Yeah. People knew me. I've been around. I'm a local guy, so people were very, very. No one ever shut their doors. I mean, people. Napoleon Nadeau, for instance, who he owned a store that's on Hill just before it becomes Granite, where Birch Street goes and it stops. He had a store there, and I remember speaking with him for a long time. He was born in 1890, so during the corporation sole controversy, he was 21 years old, and he was 34 years old when the Ku Klux Klan marched in Saco on Main Street trying to cross the bridge. He says, we were ready for them with rocks. He was a font of information. I spoke to Adelaide Janel, and unfortunately, I spoke to probably more men than women, although I did speak to women. Most of them, they weren't only housewives bearing a lot of children, but they were working at the mills too. It was just incredible. But I was talking to Mr. Adelaide Janel, and I asked him, I said, what'd you do in your spare time? And his wife was in the kitchen. She says, they made babies, she said. But I was lucky. I don't know. I was a local guy, and a lot of people knew me, and so they were very frank, And it was nice to know that no one really felt that their lives had not been fulfilling, Like I know you mentioned about your parents, that your parents made a sacrifice to come to live in the U.S., and you probably wouldn't have had the positions that you had had you stayed in Quebec. Well, they felt the same way.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you find who to speak to?
Random. I mean, Napoleon Nadeau had been a state senator for a long time, so I was interested in him, And in politics, he said, c'est tous des républicains. They're all Republicans. Because Louis Lozier actually ran for, he got the Democratic nomination in 1950, but he lost 60-40, I guess. But I talked to some relatives. I mean, my aunt, the one who used to take me to all the football games, I spoke with her because she was the oldest daughter. She was the first one who came to Biddeford. It was they sort of followed each other from Fort Kent, But no, I didn't have a specific plan. Whoever was available, really.
Any big surprises?
Not really.
Or stories that you remember when you were doing the research that you didn't expect?
Let me, I've got the list of the people I interviewed here. See if I can, but I guess the answer is no. I can't think of it. Although one of the things that surprised me, whenever you read a church history, the history of St. Joseph's, everybody is lovey-dovey, is great, no problems at all. Well, it took 10 years to build that church, and they did have the crisis of 1877, a big depression. But if you read like the little official ones, they say, Father Curé Ponsardin, a great man, and Father Dupont, a great man. Well, Ponsardin had all kinds of trouble because apparently he was lending personal money to the parishioners, and there was all kinds of financial wheeling and dealing or something. And the bishop at that time was Father Healy, James Augustine Healy. He was the first black mulatto bishop in Catholic bishop in the U.S. And he spoke French because he was from Louisiana. But he said, we can't let this happen. The money is disappearing because it took 10 years. In 1877, all they had was the soubassement, and they had 4 walls, nothing else. And they had to settle this in Rome. There's at the diocese, you have a big volume. It's called Document relatif à la cause de Jean-Marie Robert, de James Augustine, de Jean-Paul Sardan contre James Augustine Healy. And apparently the Pope ruled for Ponsardin, for the pastor, but the bishop says, I don't want him in my diocese, and he went to Colorado. He went to Leadville, Colorado, which is like a mining town, and he got into all kinds of trouble over there. My daughter lives in Colorado. The one who came to Syracuse to the football game, she lives in Colorado, so I've been there, and the diocese over there helped me out and get documentation. But anyway, there was blood on the floor when this parish was founded, and Father Dupont, Bishop Healy, asked for a Canadian priest to come, and Ponsardin was still in town, so I said, I'm the pastor, and Father Dupont said, no, I'm the pastor. I get the letter from, and of course Dupont got into a lot of trouble with Bishop Walsh. It was called the Corporation Soul Controversy. I've got that as one of my chapters. And that was a surprise too. I mean, people demonstrating in the streets, crowds of people. Napoleon was saying, "What's really exciting?" He said. So those kinds of things surprised me, but not anything that Napoleon Nando told me that kids who used to work at the mill, they didn't open the gates or something till 7:00, and they were so eager to work because they were paid on piecework and stuff. They used to climb over the fence and jump over and start before stopping. Yeah.
Wow. Any big challenges in putting that together that you can that come to mind?
Well, like I said, I wrote this in Japan, and so I had a dissertation advisor, and I would send him chapters. And I didn't hear from him. He's a busy guy, and so what I did was I wrote to the secretary of the department, a lady, Ann Hayes. She ran the place, and I said, I've sent these chapters to Professor so and so, and he hasn't answered. So 2 days later, I get a letter from him saying, I ran into Ann Hayes. She said, I'm sure she rushed down to his office and said, just get off your behind, So it was a little hard because I was far away. But once I got to Montreal, which was my second post, I had to go to Syracuse to defend the dissertation. I actually stayed with my professor. He was a bachelor, and things moved well from there.
That reminds me. So back then, where you said you got a letter from him, so you must have had to mail your chapters. In what we affectionately call today snail mail.
Yeah, not only that,
and from Japan.
Yeah. Well, we had FPO and APO.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I didn't have the problem there, but yeah, it was slower. Yeah, everything was slower.
Okay. Let's see, and then so you continued to work in the Foreign Service,
right.
And so tell me about your children.
Okay, we have 3 kids. The oldest was born in Syracuse, and so it was the youngest who was with us at Syracuse 3 weeks ago. And her son. So we told Oliver, "This is where your Aunt Monica was born, right in this building, But she was born in October 1970, and Francesca was born in Montreal. She's our little Canadian, because. When I got back from Japan, what I was hoping was to stay in Washington after my wife was due. She was due in January in 1976, and what happened was that someone resigned from Montreal, and when you're when you're in the foreign service, the needs of the service come first. And they said you got to get over there. So I mean, I remember. It's funny you mentioned this because I got to Montreal January 7th, 1976, and my wife was about 8 months pregnant. I remember the night before going, I went. The Thorn Academy was playing, and I just wanted to go to see if I knew anybody, say goodbye and stuff. And I saw Mr. Cody. He was collecting tickets. He had been there for 6 years at that point. And I spoke to him and I told him I'm going to Montreal. And I said, if you go, you come to the consulate and I'll show you around and stuff. And then our third child, Greg, little boy, was born in Arlington. I went from Montreal to San Jose, Costa Rica. When we came back from Costa Rica, this is when we came back when my daughter spent a month at the St. Andrews Grammar School. But I was learning Italian in the summer of 1980, and he was born in Arlington. So they were all born in different places, but they were all baptized at St. Joseph's. As Monica was baptized in December. She was 2 months old, and Fran was baptized in April of 1976. She was 3 months old, and Greg was born on July 12th, and we came back to Biddeford before heading to Italy, to Naples, and he was baptized, I think, on October 25th, and we left for Italy on October 26th, 1980. So those are my kids. Fran went to Clemson, and they all went to the same high school near where we live. Fran went to Clemson. Monica went to Mary Washington, which is in Fredericksburg. It's a small school, a couple of thousand students, and they have a lot of sports and stuff. But Monica lives with us because your mom has macular degeneration. You know what that means. My wife doesn't drive anymore, so we've got 2 drivers now, and Monica's never been married. And Fran lives in Colorado, and our son Greg lives 20 miles from where we are. He has 2 kids, and Fran has 1, so we have 3 grandchildren.
Now, have you done anything to help them get to know your culture and language?
Fran was born in Canada, and I was speaking more French there because I had neighbors who spoke French, but I don't know, élever les enfants, c'est dur. Raising kids is hard, and trying to raise them in a foreign language is even harder. So two of my kids were young enough in Costa Rica. They went to Costa Rican schools, and they know some Spanish, and so that they can make out some of the French words, but they don't speak French. And it's too bad because it's possible. I don't know if you know the Fortier family, Dr. Fortier's kids. Well, Bernie, and I know the others too, Hélène and Mrs. Lebrec, Marie. I mean, they've worked hard to keep French. And I'm going to see Bernie Sunday. He's coming down for some kind of a family event. But that's a family their dad, the Dr. Fortier, was very proud of his French, and he belonged to the Club Richelieu, or an organization of Franco-American professionals that got together and spoke French. So, but no, I guess the short answer to your question is no.
How about you and your continued connection to Biddeford?
Yeah, I know fewer and fewer people. Each time I come, I try to see folks that I've known, and that was one of the reasons I was trying to make sure we met today, because the rest of my week is pretty well taken up. I try to read the local newspapers online and things, and I talk to people. I've known Dr. Beaupre, Norm Beaupre, for 50 years, so I'm going to see him Saturday. But he gives me some of the lowdown. I get the big news when St. James, when they consolidated the 3 grammar schools into St. James. Several people sent me all kinds of articles about that. You see those newspapers there. My sister-in-law says all kinds of stuff that she knows I'll be interested in. So I keep abreast of what's going on with the Good Shepherd sisters, because one of the sisters was a high school classmate, and of course we weren't in the same class because we were separate. But I knew her. I should add about St. Joseph's and St. Louis. They were in the same building. The wing for St. Joseph's was smaller than the rest of the building, but there were glass doors that separated that wing from the rest of the building. Only once a year was that door open. It was for signing yearbooks. And although my senior year, and I said I didn't have any women in my class from fourth grade to grad school, my senior year we did have 5 students in trigonometry and 4 in physics from St. Joseph's that I still know and see,
Now, when you tell people that you're from Biddeford, or what is it that how would you characterize what the community has been like for you?
Yeah. Okay. When I tell people I'm from Biddeford, I tell them, well, it's an old mill town. I said, very famous. I said, have you ever heard of the Lady Pepperell product line? And some of them have, And I said those things were made there. I said Velux blankets. I think Francis Spencer was the chemist who developed the process. And Pepperell was able to stay open much longer than the Bates and the Sokolol. One of the reasons was the Velux line. I learned that. I didn't know much about industrial history. I mean, David Vermette knows a lot more, but those are some of the things that I learned when I was doing research for my dissertation. But yeah, I tell them it's an old mill town, and I tell them that when I was growing up, 75% of the population was of French Canadian origin, which is true. And when I was at Bowdoin, we had 2 French teachers, 2 French. I guess they were. They took sections of the French from the big course. They weren't teaching assistants, but they weren't full professors either. But anyway, they came from France. They were young guys, and they would have a French table. So I invited them to Biddeford. I said, you got to see this, They were just, I took them to Mass, and we went to the cemetery. I had them speak to French, to friends, and talk about the difference between the French spoken in Biddeford and the French spoken in France. But they came a couple of times. They were really fascinated.
So I've asked you a lot of questions. Is there anything else you want to share that maybe just didn't happen to come up yet?
I think I've told. I guess I'll tell some sort of little off color stories. One story, and this is just the way it was. Nobody thought anything bad about it. Remember, I told you that Dick Agresti, Du Tremble, and John Conroy had this special French class. One of my classmates came to St. Joseph's grammar school in the 6th grade. So he had been to public schools till the 6th grade. And a good guy, he's passed away, but we stayed in touch, and we were good friends. And he was a funny guy. But anyway, he is a scientist. We used to call him the mad scientist. He would sign his yearbook, the mad scientist. And French was just difficult for him. And he didn't have a special class. He was with us. We were 7 years ahead of him. Anyway, this was 8th grade now. And one of the teachers, he just didn't have as much patience as other teachers and could not teach French to somebody who didn't have a French background. That was his problem. Anyway, Ray made very little progress in French. And we used to have our grades. Monsignor Hive used to come to our class and distribute the grades, les bulletins, they call them, okay? And he'd start with the best students first, fine, And then when you get toward the end, the guys with the lowest grades, he said, 65, c'est pas bien, c'est pas bon ça, je veux que tu fasses meilleur. And they used to post the grades in the back of the back on the wall in the back of the classroom. Again, no one thought a thing about it. But I remember near Ray Hewitt's name, there was no grade. There was in red, It said, "It's hopeless." Yeah. And he remembered this because when I was working on my book, he says, "Make sure you put that in there. Make sure you put that in there. It's hopeless." He did very well, by the way. He worked on the Wiscasset. He was a scientist, and he went to Wentworth Institute. And he worked on the Wiscasset nuclear power plant, and then he worked at the naval base over near Newport, Rhode Island. And he could fix anything. And one of his, as a sidelight, he lived in one of those railroad. Who's the 19th century railroad guy who had this big, huge palace in Newport. It was owned by the state of Rhode Island, and he lived in there, and he got it rent-free just to fix the place up. Yeah.
The Breakers, I think, is that the name of the...
It might have been. I don't remember the name, but I do know it was owned by the state of Rhode Island. I'm trying to think of the name of this railroad magnate in the 19th century. He's a very famous guy. I just can't think now. But it was like a J. Pierpont Morgan type of guy, you know. They had all kinds of these huge palaces on the beach, on the shore.
I can't remember the name of the family, but I think the name of that estate is called the Breakers. It's still open to visitors nowadays. Yeah. So I often like to wrap this up by saying, what is it in particular that you would want people to take away from from hearing your story?
You know, immigration is my bag. So when I see when I hear all the anti-immigrant sentiment that is going on today, and this David Vermette talks about this a lot with how were the French Canadians treated. You know, it was the same thing. I mean, you know, you had these guys. Not only didn't speak English, they were Catholic, and the same kind of attacks that were aimed at us in the 19th century, they're repeated today. You know. And I always, and I've got some French Canadian classmates who are a little on the conservative side, you know. And I said, "Oh, you remember what they used to?" And said, "Oh, that was different." "Oh, no, not really. You think about it." And I'm sure that David will talk about that because I read his blog and stuff. So there are a lot of current affairs that his readers, you know, talk about and whatever.
Okay, well, I thank you so much for taking the time to do this, yeah. And on behalf of the Biddeford Cultural Heritage Center, we thank you for sharing your story and for all the work and research that you've gone into preserving the story of Biddeford.
You're very welcome.
Okay, it is Tuesday, November 26, 2019. This is Nicole Morin-Scribner as the interviewer, and we're doing part 2 of an interview with Dr. Michael Guignard. Dr. Guignard is actually on the phone calling me from his home in Virginia, and I'm recording this from my home in Belgrade, Maine. So good morning, Michael.
Good morning.
And thank you for agreeing to do a follow-up to your initial interview. When I was looking back at the transcript, I was seeing how when we had started it, my first question is usually, where are you born? And you mentioned that you were born in Boston, but you were actually adopted. And it's a long story, and we can go back to it if you wish. But in our original interview, we never circled back to that. So I thought this would be an opportunity to explore that long story about your birth.
Okay. I had mentioned that I was adopted because I thought during the interview that we talk a little about St. Andrew's Home, which I've been doing research on, and I'll start talking about St. Andrew's Home and the different religious orders that worked in Biddeford, and then I'll talk about some of the circumstances of my birth. The reason I was interested in St. Andrew's home is that, a lot of folks, after I wrote my book about Franco-Americans in Biddeford, Maine, a lot of folks mentioned that, I hadn't talked in detail about various organizations or various institutions in Biddeford, Mary Joseph Academy or Stella Maris, or St. Francis College, or Notre Dame Hospital, St. Louis Alumni Association, and St. Andrew's Home. So because I was adopted, and because a couple of other things, when I read about this St. Andrew's Healthcare Facility now, which the building that had housed St. Andrew's Home is now St. Andrew's Healthcare Facility. People don't remember, or they misremember things about St. Andrew's Home. And another reason I was interested in doing St. Andrew's Home, researching about St. Andrew's Home, was that I was reading a book about unwed mothers, and in the book, the author interviewed 100 women. One of them, the chapter starts off saying, "My parents dropped me off on Pool Street, and I didn't see them for 4 months. They never came to visit. I was supposed to be in Old Orchard Beach getting a tan. My mother always says, make sure you get a tan." And so I wrote to the author of the book, who put me in contact with this lady. And we've had a number of conversations, and I get a better idea of what the daily life at St. Andrew's Home was like. Anyway, St. Andrew's Home was founded in 1940. The Kelly brothers, the pastor at St. Andrew's at the time was adoptee, and his brother, who died 6 months after the home was started, Zenon Decadi, who some people in the Biddeford Saco area are trying to get beatified. A very saintly man. Anyway, they thought there was a need, and I guess they would hear from other pastors who would bring the problems of some of their parishioners to them. So they thought it'd be a good idea to found a home for unwed mothers. And the first patient they had was on Easter Sunday of 1940, March 24th. And within a month they had 5 patients. So my guess is that the pastors were telling their parishioners and the daughters of their parishioners that this place is going to open, and within the first year they had about 20 patients. And by 1941, they had their own hospital. Most people don't remember that about St. Andrew's Home, but they had their own hospital. And they were underutilized, so they started accepting married women as patients also. And when I talked about St. Andrew's Home on June 3rd, we asked the question, how many people were born at St. Andrew's Home? And there are about 10 hands shot up in a crowd of 30, because it was like the Franco-American hospital, along with being a home for unwed mothers. And they accepted married women until 1952, and by then there were enough unmarried women patients that they couldn't accept anymore. And Notre Dame Hospital, which was built right next door to St. Andrew's Home on Pool Street, was opened by 1952, so the married women could go there if they didn't want to go to the Weber Hospital. And the institution started its own adoption agency in 1954, which is a big step, because before that, the adoptions, and it was always a big problem of where to find homes for these kids, because very, very few of the mothers kept their children in those days, in the 1940s and 1950s. But by the end of the time that St. Andrews stopped functioning as a home for unwed mothers, about 98% of the women kept their children, but back in the early days, 98% of the women surrendered their children for a lot of different reasons. But that was the case. One of the nuns summarized, who was associated with St. Mary's Home, summarized this very well. She said, in the 1940s, when the girls came to our home, they were told by their parents, "Don't bring your child home." And by the end of the period when they stopped accepting, they stopped serving as a hospital in 1962, and when they stopped accepting unwed mothers as patients, the girls were told, "Don't come home without the baby." So there really was a societal change in viewpoints toward unmarried mothers. But the hospital 24 hours a day that was open. I mean, there were nuns on duty all the time. There were volunteer doctors there. Some of the doctors brought their married patients to the hospital, but the ones who delivered the out of wedlock children were literally volunteers. I mean, Dr. Fortier worked there for many years. Some of his children were born there, and they had a real pride in that institution, a real Franco-American pride. It's hard to know. You don't have the names of the women who were there. I've talked to 4 women who had their babies here, who were unwed mothers, and three of them were Franco-American. 3 of them had their babies between 1964 and 1968. So the regime was pretty much the same. They would go to prenatal classes. They would study sewing and knitting, things that you would call, I guess, a domestic art. And the institution itself doubled in size in 1965. There's the Helen Cashman wing of the home, and it almost doubled in size. So they had a reading room, they had a little library. The premises were much more welcoming and were less cramped after 1965. But by 1973, they moved out of their big building on Pool Street, and they set up 3 group homes, one in Bangor, one in Lewiston, and one in Biddeford. And by doing this, they got state money. The new director, who was a fellow named Gil Domain, who passed away about 5 years ago, I got a chance to interview him, and he always, thought very highly of that institution, and really liked to work with the nuns. But he was the one who got that $240,000 a year grant from the state of Maine to help unwed mothers and poor people who needed the services of St. Mary's Home. By 2013, I think they stopped accepting unwed mothers. What they were doing at that point, from 2013 till 2017, is that they were helping young mothers to be better mothers. They were teaching him teaching them childcare and things like that. And these were state programs. Right now, the only thing functioning that's a direct descendant of St. Andrew's Home is that they have a facility that helps victims of sexual trafficking. And also they have the Esther residence, which isn't a direct descendant of St. Andrew's Home, but they're doing the same thing, helping women and children, in distress. It's a really nice story, and they have a website, www.standrehome.org. You can read about the services that they provided over the years, and it's something that hasn't been written much about. So when I finally get my act together and put this all together, I'll make sure that the library has it and people get a chance to read in more detail about St. Andrew's Home without any of the urban legends that have developed around that institution.
You mentioned urban legends. Can you think of one in particular that comes to mind?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I've spoken to a lot of different people who've had some association with St. Andrew's Home. I have a cousin who worked at St. Andrew's Home as a painter in the summer of 1968. And I asked him, I said, were you painting Notre Dame Hospital or were you painting St. Andrew's Home? He said, no, we were painting St. Andrew's Home. And he says, we were expressly forbidden to go on the fourth floor. That's where the unmarried woman had the whole floor. And he says, we were expressly forbidden to go there or peek in there or whatever, you know. And he says, on the penalty of immediately getting fired. And he told me, he says, we started talking among ourselves because sometimes we'd leave the premises at 5 p.m. and there was one of our workers was missing. So we thought that maybe he had crossed this invisible line and the nuns had shot him with a shotgun. And I said to him, no, I said, the guy just got tired of working and just walked off the job. That's why he was missing. But that's one urban legend. And when I gave my talk on June 3rd, five of the Good Shepherd sisters were there, and I was going to ask them if they ever had a shotgun and knew how to use one, you know, but I didn't want to embarrass them, so I didn't ask that question to them. But that's one. Also, St. Andrew's Home, when the DeCary brothers were thinking about a place to have it, they bought a farm. The property of St. Andrew's Home was originally a farm, and there was a farmhouse. And it was isolated. It was 3 miles from downtown. I mean, you know where it is, and I guess you get people knew where it was. They would drive by it, and I know this for a fact. I mean, some young kids would go behind the home along the river, and they tried to. Some of the girls were walking over there, a little contemplation time, maybe in the afternoon or something, and they go over to harass them. And I know a couple of guys who, when they realized what they were doing, they stopped. I mean, they were 13, 14-year-old boys who get all kinds of trouble. But the nuns would go out there also and shoo them away. And that one's not an urban legend. It actually happened. No, it's not very publicized though. But that's another urban legend. The 4 young ladies that I've spoken to, I mean, really, one of them hadn't been back. She lives in New Hampshire. One of them hadn't been back since she had her baby, and so I arranged for us to get a tour of St. Andrew's healthcare facility, and she was looking around trying to figure out where her room was. But it was a very, very emotional experience for her. She had her baby at Notre Dame, and when she saw the condition of the hospital was all run down, with broken windows, and it wasn't being used anymore, it was abandoned. It looked terrible. And I remember she just cried. She just couldn't believe it. And I've since told her that they finally tore the place down. It was high time. I guess with hospitals like that, you can never figure out who the owners are.
Were there any...
Nicole, did you get a chance to see Notre Dame Hospital before it was torn down? It was in really bad shape.
I did not get to see it before it was torn down.
There's a video. If you go on YouTube and put St. Andrew's Home, Biddeford, Maine, some people broke in there and just filmed what it looked like inside. Broken glass, all kinds of stuff. It's very eerie, But if I can go back to the 4 girls that I've spoken to, I mean, one had her baby in 1964 when they were building the addition. So there was a lot of commotion, a lot of hammers, things like that. She's from Portland. The young lady from New Hampshire had her baby in 1967, and she didn't want to surrender it right away. She and her parents were in a constant battle about that. And then she remembered she was a big Red Sox fan. She remembered that she finally signed the papers to surrender her child in New Hampshire on the day that the Red Sox lost the World Series to the St. Louis Cardinals. So it would have been, I think, like October 14th, 1967. She had her baby in August, so the baby was in foster care. Most of the time, the adoptions were made even before the child was born. So the mother would leave 2 or 3 days before the adoptive parents came. It was it wasn't any of this stuff like you had in Ireland where the mother was allowed to stay with the baby for 3 years and then they took the baby away. No, that didn't happen at St. Andrews.
In the research that you did at St.
I'm trying to figure out one person. 3 of the women had their babies between 64 and 68. One had her baby in 1980. So when I spoke to her, I said, "Well, what did you think about our fair sea of Biddeford?" And she said, "Well, I never went there." She said. I said, "You didn't go there?" She said, "No." She said, "When I found out I was pregnant, I got in touch with the nuns because I wanted to surrender my child. And the nuns took care of all the medical expenses and things like that." She was a student at Farmington, University of Maine, Farmington. And she had her baby and she surrendered it and she never came to Biddeford. And 3 of the 4 of the women that I've spoken to have had reunions with their birth child. I mean, they knew who their birth child was and they communicated. One, there's been no reunion because the sisters have tried to communicate with the child, but I guess the child doesn't want any contact. Because for somebody who's adopted, you often wonder why. Well, why was I given up? And the 4th woman that I spoke to, she was from Biddeford, and so I said, since you were trying to hide, I said, did you ever think about going somewhere else? And she says, I knew enough about St. Andrews that they would keep my secret and they would keep my privacy. And so she just didn't go downtown. I mean, the girls were allowed to go downtown. Sometimes they'd accompany the nuns and shop and things, but she didn't because she knew that people would recognize her.
When you did your research, were there any surprises?
Not really, because I had done research about different homes for unwed mothers. I hadn't realized that when I started, I hadn't realized that St. Andrews Home had its own hospital. I mean, literally had its own hospital right there on the premises until 1962. And by then, there were fewer women coming to the home. And as a cost-saving measure, you had Notre Dame Hospital right next door. As a cost-saving measure, they just closed their hospital. And Mr. Rowe, I think I forgot his first name, Andre maybe. He was the caretaker, and he lived right there on the corner of Pool and the driveway leading to St. Andrews Home. And he always made sure when it snowed, he always made sure that the thing was plowed, and if there were any emergencies at the home, that they could get the young lady to the hospital in about a minute. I mean, he would be there with his pickup truck and his chains, and the hospital was just right next door. So those kind of things. I also didn't know when I started my research that there was an operating farm. The property had been a farm, and Sister Saint Armand was the head of the farming operation. They had horses, they had cows, they had all kinds of vegetables. And after she died, the farm was discontinued. But the girls would help pick strawberries or whatever vegetables they have, and they help can them for the winter. Because St. Andrews Home was pretty much a low-budget operation. I mean, the sisters, the money came out of the congregation until because the diocese didn't do much, and until Gilles Domingue in 1971 got that state of Maine $240,000 money to run St. Andrew's Home, the sisters were financially responsible, and they spent a lot of money. I mean, it was a financial drain on the congregation. But it was part of their apostolate, because they were running a home for unwed mothers in Quebec also. It was called La Crèche, the cradle, and they ran it from 1872 to 1970. So my guess is, and I haven't been able to confirm this, but my guess is that some of the sisters who were transferred from Quebec to the U.S., some of them were already trained to have worked in homes for unwed mothers when they came to Biddeford to work at St. Andrew's Home.
What did you find out about how Biddeford as a community felt about St. Andre's Home? Were they supportive?
Good. That's a good question. In 1943, Hélène Tivière thought that there was a town and gown conflict, if you want, or some of the people in Biddeford, looked at that building with a jaundiced eye. She started the St. Andrew's Dames. I don't remember the exact name now, but it was a lay support organization, and they raised money. This organization was founded in 1943, and it's had different names, and their fundraising efforts were named after Sister Saint Elizabeth, who was the director and who had her master's degree from in social work from Boston College, and she's the one who headed the adoption agency. So she was the only one who would know who the parents were. So the secrets were kept if the young ladies wanted them kept, and also the adopted parents. But yeah, they always had fundraising drives. They had bean supper. They had open houses. There's a couple of pictures I saw in the archives of about 40 women, including Dr. Forty, his wife, who became an officer of the organization. So, and in the early days, the institution ran on the congregation's money and donations from townspeople. FX Immo would come. He donated bright lights for the operating room, for the delivery room. Edouard Delorge's bakery, donated money. The Red Cross would come with 12 dozen eggs, whatever. They accepted whatever they could use. The sisters did. So I think in the early years it was an accepted institution because it was a Franco institution. I don't have names of who was there in 1940 and who was there in 1970, but because the institution accepted anyone, Protestants, Jewish. But my guess is that most of the residents, most of the patients there were of Franco-American origin. So the four women that I spoke to were Franco-American, both parents Franco-American. One, her mother was Franco-American, father was Irish, and the fourth one, the young lady from Portland was Irish. And it's funny because three of the four women ended up marrying the father of their child. So you wonder, you say to yourself, "Oh, gee, why didn't they just get married before the child was born?" But everyone has a unique story, and there were reasons why the marriage didn't take place before the birth of the child. And what's ironic is that once they got married, they still, you can't say, "Well, we're married now, we want our child back." It didn't work that way. The adoptions were secret, and I guess it would have been unfair to the adoptive parents to us if they lose a child that they have adopted and been living with them for a couple of years. It's a problem now. I go. There's an organization here in D.C. that helps women reunite with their their birth child, and some of the stories are kind of sad. But to answer your question, I think in the early years there was a great deal of community support. I think once the home moved from Pool Street over to Prospect Street, the new group home in Biddeford was right near Waterhouse Field, right near the little football field there where Biddeford High plays. And once it moved from there, I don't know, people sort of lost interest because they were getting state money with state rules, and some of the rules had changed, and there was just less community involvement.
Where you mentioned that the different experiences were all unique stories, is that a good segue to your story?
Yeah, mine's kind of unique. Although my guess is, and people didn't keep records. This thing was all secret. So, but my guess is that among Franco-Americans, if the child wasn't given up for adoption through an adoption agency, another member of the family just they might have 5 or 6 kids, and they get one more. In my case, and these are things that I didn't find out until I found out about the circumstances of my birth. I knew I had been born in Boston, and I knew that I was adopted. I always knew that. But when I found out who my birth mother was, and I had a chance to speak with her. And by the way, we spoke in French because we didn't want anybody else who might be listening wherever we were, but wherever we were, we didn't want anybody else hearing. So we spoke in low tones in French. But she told me that my grandfather, and this is funny because I knew my grandparents. I had the same set of grandparents, And my grandmother was the firebug. She was tough. My grandfather was an easygoing type of guy. But when my mother told me about this, she said, she says it wasn't Meme who wouldn't let me bring you home. It was Pepe. So he was a shoe repair person, and I guess I don't know. He might have thought that this would hurt his business or something. I have no idea, but he had a daughter who couldn't have any children, had been married for 6 years. My adoptive parents, my parents were married in 1940 by Officer Dicati, and she couldn't have children, so my grandfather thought it was perfect. He said, you're not married yet, you're coming back to live with us, and your sister Pat can have your child, and that's what eventually happened. And I asked my birth mother, I said, why didn't you go to St. Andrew's home? You had sisters who lived in Biddeford. And she said, well, my doctor had this connection to a home that was called Talisakumi. It's a Greek word in the Bible meaning rise, young maiden. And this particular home in Boston, it's in the Jamaica Plain area. This particular home had been in existence for almost 100 years. When my birth mother went there. But anyway, to make a long story short, she gave me the name of my birth father, and she knew me very well. Remember, my birth mother was at my high school graduation, my college graduation, my wedding, any big family thing. I mean, she was there, So at least she saw me. She saw me growing up, and I was. Obviously, I was her oldest child. She had four more kids, and she had in the early 1980s told my sister. And of course, the other relatives knew, but my sister knew. My sister is the one who finally told me because I found out in February of 2003, and my birth mother died in June because she had cancer. So when I found out, I went up to. She was living in Lewiston. I went up to Lewiston, and we had some nice, long talks before she passed away. But she knew that I'd go up to Fort Kent, which is where I was conceived in Aroostook County somewhere, and I found the name of a gentleman who had the same name as my birth father. So I made arrangements to go visit him without telling him anything. I told him I was doing research, and I sent him a copy of my book. So, we started talking. I drove into his driveway, and he comes up and meets me. And we spoke in French the whole time. So, he knew I wasn't an imposter or anything. I was one of him, And so we ended up going to Eagle Lake because they had a little roulette, as they call them. I had never heard that word, but it's a little trailer. And I'm telling him the story, and finally he asked me, he said, because I'm telling him that I found out who my birth mother was, and he asked me, he said, how long after you found out who your birth mother was did you contact me? And I told him, I said, Pat, 3 days. Anyway, so I finally told him. He says, wow, he says, incredible. He says, I always knew you were one of us, he told me. It made me feel real good. Anyway, so I said, Pat, we got to do a blood test. This thing happened 57 years ago. We don't know public link, so we don't need that. But he had a sister, and I met her while I was up there in Fort Kent, and we did a blood test. And to make a long story short, it came out negative. So I was very embarrassed, But we continued corresponding, and he helped me look for other folks. Apparently, there was more than one person with that name. He helped me look around. He's passed away now, but we remained friends until he died. His wife was born in Canada, so I always tease her about being Canadian. I sing little Canada for her whenever I meet her up there. So that's basically my story. And it turns out a lot of my relatives knew this, and so when I found out about it, I go back at the when I got married, for instance, my parents were sitting in the front row, but my birth mother was sitting by herself. Her husband was with the kids, sort of in the back. She was sitting in a tree by herself, and I never gave it a thought then. But going back, and also, when I graduated from college, she was working at Bates, and she was very emotional when I graduated from college. I thought maybe because she had a college connection in Maine or something, but now I realize why. So that's my story. And to get back to your question, my guess is that for those Franco-Americans who were born out of wedlock, who weren't surrendered through an adoption agency, my guess is that they were they were raised by relatives. And I don't have any data on that because a lot of it remains secret. So we'll never know for sure. We'll never have statistics.
It's a very interesting story.
Yeah, it's and I stay in touch with more closely now with my four siblings. Two live in Maine, including this one sister and three brothers. Two live in Maine. One lives in Florida, and the other lives in Seattle. And the one who lives in Florida was my neighbor in Virginia for about 10 years. So my aunt, my birth mother, would come visit, and of course I was always made part of that ensemble, and I thought it was because I was their cousin. But the boys didn't know about me. I told them after my birth mother died, because my sister had been sworn to secrecy, and she didn't tell them. But I was always part of the gang, and I thought it was because I was a relative, because I was a cousin. But it was the relationship was closer than that,
Wow. Now, how did your birth parent? So your adopted parents aren't the ones that told you. They told you you were adopted.
That's all. That's all they told me.
Uh-huh.
And what's ironic is, you know, my parents died in 1987 and 1988. Okay, and my birth mother died in 2003. And her husband, and this is funny now, you know, it's really amazing when I think about it. I was at my birth mother's wedding. I'm there. It says Mr. and Mrs. Wilfred Guignard and son. You know, I read that to my wife, and I said, it doesn't say whose son I was. It just said and son. You know, if you put a few commas and stuff, it could be her son, the bride's son, you know. That's the way I read it. That's the way I read it now. But what I find strange is that if it would have been uncomfortable for everyone to know while everyone was still alive, there was a 16-year gap between the time that my mother died and my birth mother died. You know, it would have given me a 16-year head start on trying to find my father's family. But you know, I've had a good life. I was raised very well, a lot of love. So you know, I can't complain. You know, and I knew my birth mother. It's funny because she was the youngest of the family, and my wife had met most of my aunts and most of my uncles and stuff. She always liked my birth mother the best. I guess I guess she treated my wife special, you know, and it's funny now I know why, you know.
Well, I think that it's interesting that despite being adopted, you were still connected to your actual birth family.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I had the same grandparents. And I sort of wonder, you know, I don't know if my grandfather died, my maternal grandfather died in 1958. So I was 12 years old. And I was, you know, pretty much like any other kid. I probably had a little better grades and stuff. But I wondered if you ever thought, I'm sure that as far as he was concerned, everything turned out fine. But I wonder if you ever thought, I wonder what this kid would be doing if he had stayed up in Fort Kent with his birth mother and lived with us instead of having gone and lived in Biddeford, Maine. But, you know, I'm sure that he avait pas de remords de conscience. He didn't have any conscience attacks. It didn't bother him. My birth mother, though, this is one thing I found out when I spoke to her in 2003 before she died, is that I was actually in a foster home. I was born in July, and I wasn't adopted until early 1947. I was in a foster home in Caribou because my birth mother wouldn't surrender me, but she couldn't bring me to Fort Kent either, and she would travel from Fort Kent to Caribou to see me, and she said that the family that I had was very, very nice. But, you know, the situation just became untenable, and she knew that she wouldn't be able to keep me. So she finally signed the papers. And, you know, I never saw any legal papers and things. I do know I was baptized in Jamaica Plain. There's a big church. It's called, what's it called? I can't remember the name, but it's a common religious name. And I've been there because I was hoping to get another copy of my birth certificate to see if it had listed as a father, and there was none. And in Massachusetts is one of those states that you can get your real birth certificate. So I got that also. So if I hadn't found out through my sister, I would have eventually found out before my birth mother died, because Massachusetts passed that law, I think, in 1999. You know, and you know, once I'm sorry, they passed it after 2003 because I would have requested my real birth certificate. When I get the real birth certificate, there's my birth mother's maiden name, and it says father unknown. But Maine has that law also. And there were a lot of very human interest stories about people who made contact with they had and things like that because they were able to get access to their real birth certificate.
Now, something that I'm confused about, Michael, is you said that, so you do know who your birth father is?
I don't.
Oh, okay.
All I have is a name, and I've made some discreet inquiries since the blood test that I took with the people who I thought would have been my half brothers and sisters. That came out negative.
Okay.
I've looked around a little, but I haven't. I don't know who my birth father was.
Okay, that's where I got confused. Now I understand.
What had happened was that my birth mother gave me a name, and what I did was I went to the internet and stuff, and I saw somebody with that same name, and his father had the same name, which would have been my father. So I went up to Fort Kent. Well, about 4 days before my mother died, my sister called me in June 2003. She said, "You better come up," and I came up, and I went up to Fort Kent. When I came back to Lewiston a couple of days later, my birth mom died. But I went up to meet the person with the same name as my father, whose father also had the same name, and we spent the day together as I mentioned, and then I did the blood test with his sister.
I see.
That came out negative.
I see.
So I've not found my birth father's family. I mean, I'm sure he'd be passed away by now, but even some of his children may have passed away. But I find, I don't know, cousins or grandchildren or whatever.
I see.
No, I don't know who my father's my birth father's family was.
So you must have an appreciation for the work that the sisters at St. Andre's did for all those families.
It was incredible because you read the archives, and they would be taking 7 or 8 children. They were taking care of 7 or 8 children at the same time, and not all of them were adopted right away. I mean, it was today there's a real shortage of babies to be adopted, but then it wasn't the case, and so it was hard for them to find adoptive parents, and most of the adoptive parents, from what I can read in the archives, already had children. The nuns would say, sacrifice des parents. They picked, some families adopted 2 or 3 kids when they had 4 or 5, because the sisters, the sisters couldn't take care of these kids forever. So they really worked hard. So that's one of the reasons that they established the adoption agency, because then, there were out-of-staters would come to Biddeford to adopt kids, and they did home studies. Before that, the adoptions were arranged informally with the pastor of the church. Jerome Plant, Jerome Plant? He was town manager in Old Orchard Beach. And he used to be Peter Kairos. Peter Kairos is a congressman from southern Maine, and he was Peter Kairos's head staff member. And he's still alive, but he adopted a child from St. Andrews. And I said, before 1954, when they had the adoption agency, and I said, well, what was the process? And he says, well, the pastor knew me. He went over there and he talked to the sister, and he says, Jerome Plant's a good guy. And so he got the baby. And that child, who was born at St. Mary's Home, has been very, very successful, according to Jerome. So there are a lot of success stories. And I mean, the sisters really worked hard. There was always about 10 or 12 sisters staying overnight. Not all of them who stayed overnight worked at St. Andrew's Home. They didn't need a staff of 12 every day. But there's always people there. And Mr. Rowe was 100 yards away from the front door. if there was any emergency. Because one of the problems with in general with homes for unwed mothers is that there might have been just one person at night. If a girl went into labor, or they in a big city or something, they needed to get a taxi and stuff. It took them a while to get to the hospital, and there's some horror stories about those kinds of institutions. But at St. Andrews, because of the proximity of even after 1962, when they closed their own hospital, Notre Dame was right next door. After that, between 69 and 73, they went from Poole Street to the Weber Hospital. But once they moved to Prospect Street, they were a lot closer to the Weber Hospital than they had been when they were on Poole Street, And then when the Weber closed and the Southern Maine Medical Center opened there on the Alfred Road, it was still not very far from Prospect Street. So I do have an appreciation for just the sisters who kept the log and everything else. I mean, they would have meetings with the Danes, the organization of townspeople that would help raise money, and they talked about the girls because everybody, people were curious. What kind of girls are these? Who are they, and where did they come from? And she said, they're just normal young ladies who've had a really bad time. So from no fault of their own, pretty much.
Wow. Well, I absolutely thank you for making yourself available to tell us a little bit more about this long story, and especially connecting it to St. Andre's, which was a very important institution in Biddeford.
Yeah, the sisters, I think the sisters did a great job, and I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. It's very hard to capture the past, and all of these interviews. I mean, it's incredible that you interviewed Bob Cody 3 months before he died.
Yes.
Pretty much, I mean, when he died. And I was in Maine, and that's the first thing I thought about. I said, Nicole, got a chance to interview him back in April, because that's there were a lot of things that Bob Cody was my teacher, Mr. Cody was my teacher, but there were a lot of things that I learned from your interview with him,
Yeah, I certainly have. Enjoying this and find the stories that we're capturing are very interesting.
Oh yeah, one of the stories with Mr. Cody is that his father, I guess, had the keys to the parish hall, so Mr. Cody could go in there and shoot some hoops with his friends.
Yeah, I thought that was funny too.
Yeah, I think I have that story. He must have been a really good athlete to get a scholarship to Boston College in those days. I mean, it wasn't an automatic thing, He must have been a really good athlete, and I guess he won the student athlete award there in his senior year. So he got his picture taken with John F. Kennedy.
Yes,
pretty impressive.
That is.
Kennedy was a first-term congressman then. He was first elected to Congress in 1946. This photo was taken before the election in 1948. When he took the photo, because he was a Knight of Columbus. I guess this was a Knight of Columbus event or something.
Yeah.
But I mean, the work that you're doing, it's gonna be preserved for posterity and for people who are doing research, because a lot of this stuff hasn't been written down. So we'll have it orally anyway.
Yes. Well, again, thank you, Michael.